Hi, my name is DeMarc Marenko, and for my presentation, I decided to talk about the moral obligations of journalists. Throughout history, time has told us that misinformation and fake news has played some sort of role in everyday news, especially now with online news articles, we have become more susceptible to it. However, journalists are often paid to tell misinformation because of certain company bias in order to make more profit, and this becomes a problem because it can harm large populations and mislead them. And with that being said, do journalists have a moral obligation to tell us the truth or listen to what their companies tell them to post? Some important definitions to look at are misinformation, which is when the truth is being misleading or inaccurate and can be used to deceive people. Fake news, however, is news that is presented in stories or information which is intentionally false for misleading and deceptive purposes and can be often used in political settings. A journalist is someone who gathers information and or stories and which are then presented to the general public as news, and propaganda, which is the agenda and dissemination of facts or lies to persuade or influence a population of people. It is a known fact by now that misinformation has been around for a very long time. However, with the internet, misinformation has become more prominent, especially when you look for something specific because you are more likely to get fake news. When examining the ethical perspectives, the public tends to value the truth more because that's how they receive their news, and especially when they pay for a specific company, they would hope to expect the truth and nothing less. The news companies, however, don't value the truth as much because they value profit more, and they will often target your bias, and the journalists will do that too as well. And when people start to remove that bias, they will be more likely to start losing money and then lose their jobs. The stakeholders here would be the public because they receive the news from the journalists because they make a salary from the news companies because they receive profit from the people, and the government which regulates them. With all this being said, in the end, the public trumps the salary of the journalist because the truth is way more significant than the journalist's salary because misinformation and fake news will harm more people in the long run, either physically or mentally. So the first argument I made here was about physical harm. During COVID, there was tons of false information being spread amongst many news platforms, and many of which caused people to refrain from receiving the vaccine. According to a survey done by Harvard Kennedy, 31% of Americans agreed that COVID-19 was purposely created and spread despite the absence of any credible evidence for its intentional development. And due to this, people rejected the vaccine and put themselves in more danger because journalism decided to go ahead with the propaganda that COVID-19 was not in fact that serious or even real. And with 11.3% of the population having diabetes and around 9% of the population having asthma in the US, according to the CDC, this critically endangered each and every one of their lives due to misinformation. To continue on, although it was a scary time for all of us, even the world and health leaders, misinformation should not be able to spread at this capacity, especially when journalists should tell the truth. According to the National Center for Biotechnology Information, the spread of health misinformation is an emerging issue facing the public health authorities. Health misinformation could delay proper treatment to patients, which could further add more casualties to public health domain. Often people tend to believe health-related information that is shared online. As you can see here, even the government realizes how big of an issue this is truly becoming, which is why journalists should tell the truth to prevent physical harm from continuing. Now, one may object to this by using common sense. To say that we ought to know what is true from false is becoming much more difficult, especially because online you have the capability to say almost anything. However, when it comes to health, you should know who to trust given the amount of resources and accessibility to government and health-related websites, not online news articles. Suppose you had to choose between a news article or the CDC on information related to COVID-19. Most likely you would choose the CDC because it is government-funded and provides up-to-date information backed by scientists and not hearsay. In fact, if you were to search up the word COVID right now on a search engine, you're most likely to have the CDC website be your first choice. And with that being said, journalists do not need to report the truth and sacrifice their job if you should already have some idea on which sites are trustworthy and which aren't. My response to this would be people can't tell the difference between truth and fiction. Given that people should know what sources to rely on is much easier said than done. In fact, the Pew Research Center stated that recently reported that half of the U.S. adults say made-up news and information is a very big problem in the country today, and about 2/3 say it causes a great deal of confusion about the basic facts of current issues and events. With that being stated, if people are already confused on current news, misinformation will only continue to throw them off their judgment and mindset because they are believing that it could be the truth. If you look to the graph here on the right, nearly 2/3 of adults find it very hard to tell what is true when elected officials speak. 64% find it very hard when listening to officials. 48% of them find it hard when using social media. The majority tends to find it not so hard when watching television, cable news. And the majority, again, also doesn't find it as hard when talking with people you know. My second argument here is going to be mental aspects. When looking at mental aspects, fake news can cause mental distress, especially in health-related concerns. According to the World Health Organization, the systematic review found that people feel mental and social, political, or economic distress due to misleading and false health-related content. Though journalists are often just told to put misinformation that is given to them, they are the primary cause for this type of distress. When looking at echo chambers, the National Center of Biotechnology Information states that repetitive exposure to contents that coincides with their pre-existing beliefs increases believability and shareability of content. This process is known as the echo chamber effect and is fueled by confirmation bias. With 62% of news companies having bias, according to Business Insider, misinformation will only continue to reinforce these echo chambers, and journalists will only continue to further that and hurt them more. Now, one may object to this by stating that they are avoidable. Though misinformation and fake news is always present, it does not mean it can be avoided, and the same goes for echo chambers as well. In avoiding the echo chamber, the author states that filter hypothesis suggests that homogeneous networks strengthen the effects of consonant media messages and diminish the effects of dissonant messages. Politically mixed networks may also cause individuals to be less resistant to dissonant messages, and that in reality, most news diets are more diverse and centrist, according to guests. This all meaning that if people were to have mixed networks, the echo chamber would be less likely to affect us, even though most networks aren't technically biased. Although it's not completely impossible to view mixed networks, most people tend to stick to one news company. According to the Pew Research Center, about 9 in 10 of those whose main source is Fox News identify as Republican, very close to the 95% of those who name MSNBC and identify as Democrats. With this, we conclude most people will stick to one news outlet, given their political beliefs, and journalists are responsible for keeping this bias. As previously stated as well, 62% of news companies are in fact biased, therefore disproving the previous claim that most news outlets are centrist. And if you look to the right, we see another picture just analyzing this type of data where we could see that Republicans will more often lean towards Fox News and Democrats will lean towards NBC. This concludes my presentation of the moral obligations of journalists. In the end, they should tell the truth because they can cause a lot of harm, both physically and mentally, to very large populations. Over here are my sources cited, and my slideshow will be in the link in the description. And yeah, thank you for watching.